You ever see those headlines comparing the economies of massive countries? Saying one is 10 times bigger than another? And you kind of wonder, how do they even figure that out? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today.
So let's start with a really specific question to get us going. Forget the news cycle for a second. When you look at the raw economic power of these three neighbors, China, India, and Pakistan, how do they really stack up? The answer, as you're about to see, is, well, it's pretty dramatic.
Okay, let's dive right into the numbers. What you're looking at here is something called nominal GDP. And wow, the difference is just stark. China's economy is an absolute giant at almost $19 trillion. India, a powerhouse in its own right, is at nearly $4 trillion. And Pakistan is around $0.4 trillion. I mean, just look at that gap. China's economy is roughly 5 times bigger than India's, and India's is more than 10 times the size of Pakistan's. It's just a staggering difference.
So how can one single number tell such a massive, complicated story? Well, it all comes down to one of the most important, most talked about metrics in all of economics: gross domestic product, or as we all know it, GDP.
Right, so let's get into it. What exactly is GDP? The easiest way to think about it is like an economy's official report card. It's that one big number that gives us a snapshot of how a country is doing, at least in economic terms.
Now, the official definition can sound a little dry, but the key bits are actually pretty straightforward. Monetary value just means we're adding up the price tags on everything. Within a country's borders is a big one. It means if it's made in that country, it counts, doesn't matter who owns the company. And specific time period, usually a year or a quarter, just make sure we're comparing apples to apples.
So how in the world do they calculate a number that huge? Well, one of the most common ways is to just add up all the spending. It follows this little formula: C plus I plus G plus net exports. So C is consumption. That's you and me buying coffee, getting a haircut, a new phone, all of it. I is investment. That's businesses spending money on new factories, software, things like that. G is government spending. Roads, bridges, defense, the whole shebang. And finally, you have net exports, which is just what a country sells to the world minus what it buys from the world. You add all that up, and boom, you've got GDP.
But here's where it gets interesting. Just knowing that big final number isn't really enough. To actually understand what's going on, you have to realize that not all GDP is the same. There are a few different flavors, and each one tells a slightly different story.
And this brings us to a really important difference: nominal versus real GDP. Nominal GDP, which is what we saw in that first chart, uses today's prices. But think about it. If prices just go up because of inflation, your nominal GDP will go up too, even if you didn't actually make any more stuff. That's why economists love real GDP. It's the hero here because it adjusts for inflation, so it gives us a much better idea of whether an economy is actually growing and producing more.
Okay, but what about a country's size? A country could have a ginormous GDP just because it has a ton of people. That's where GDP per capita comes in. It's super simple. You just take the total GDP and divide it by the population. What you get is a rough, and I mean rough, idea of the average economic output for each person. It's a much better tool for comparing the standard of living between countries.
And there's one more tricky one: PPP, which stands for Purchasing Power Parity. Just think about this. $100 in New York City definitely doesn't buy you the same amount of stuff as $100 in New Delhi, right? PPP tries to adjust for those different price levels. It basically answers the question, how much can your money really buy where you live? It gives us a much more realistic apples-to-apples comparison of people's economic well-being.
So, we've defined it, we've broken it down, but why should any of us actually care? Why is this one number all over the news and in every political debate? Well, it turns out GDP is so much more than just a boring number for economists.
This is where it gets real. GDP is the quickest vital sign we have for an economy's health. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? And based on that answer, governments and central banks make massive decisions that affect all of us. If GDP is shrinking, they might cut taxes or lower interest rates to get people spending again. If it's growing too fast, they might raise rates to cool things down. It's an absolutely critical tool for making real-world policy.
But, and this is a really big but, for all of its power, GDP is far from a perfect measurement. It's so important to understand what this number leaves out.
Yeah, GDP has some major blind spots. It says nothing about our well-being or happiness. It can't tell you if wealth is shared or if it's all going to the top 1%. It completely ignores all the unpaid work that keeps society running, like caring for kids or elderly parents. And maybe most importantly, it doesn't account for damage to the environment. Think about it. A factory that pollutes a river actually adds to GDP, but the cost of that pollution isn't subtracted anywhere.
So, let's bring it all back to where we started. Looking at this chart now, we see it with new eyes, right? We know this is nominal GDP, so it's not adjusted for inflation or for what that money can actually buy locally. And more importantly, we know that this number, as huge as it is, says absolutely nothing about the quality of life or how that economic pie is sliced up in each of these nations.
And that really is the key takeaway here. If you remember just one thing, let it be this. GDP is an absolutely essential tool for measuring economic output, but it is not, and it was never designed to be, a measure of a country's overall success or the well-being of its people.
Which, of course, leaves us with a much bigger and maybe more important question. If GDP is just one piece of the puzzle, how should we be measuring a nation's true progress? What other numbers, what other stories do we need to look at to get the full picture? That's a complicated question, but a really important one to think about. Thanks so much for tuning in.